On the 21st of October 1990, we witnessed probably the most blatant attempt at taking another driver out of a race in, well, any racing series ever. And just 7 years later, another driver was removed from an entire championship for less. This isn't hating or slamming, this is facts, and it's still a contentious subject no matter which side of the fence you sit on when it comes to the Prost and Senna rivalry. 21st of October 1990. I was 8 days old. The previous year, the championship had ended in acrimony because Senna had been disqualified for cutting the chicane after a dive bomb into that same chicane, and Prost had slammed the door completely shut. This year, more controversy leading up to the race, as Senna was once again in the media accusing the FIA of being biased against him, and being on the side of the Frenchman who just 12 months previous had been his teammate. So a recap then of why 1989 probably wasn't the controversy that everybody makes it out to be, and yes, that's how we pronounce that word in the Queen's English. Well, King's English now. Given the way that Formula 1 worked in those days, your best 11 results counted towards the World Championship. For Senna to win the title, he had to win both the Japanese Grand Prix and the Australian Grand Prix. But even with the disqualification in Japan, Senna crashed into Martin Brundle in the wet at Adelaide anyway, and would have lost the title. But then we are looking at this knowing what we know now. But the fact remains, Senna would have lost the title, disqualification, or no disqualification. And looking at the 11 best results counting rule with the 2022 looking glass, the 1988 season is also a bit of an iffy one, given that Prost scored more points than Senna over those 16 races, so eliminate the drop scores and Prost is champion. I mean, it was a strange rule, but, you know, it is what it is. Was probably a carryover from the days when getting around wasn't as easy and was way more expensive, given that the FIA didn't subsidise travel costs. It meant that if you couldn't make a round for whatever reason, then you didn't lose out on anything. Well, in theory, anyway. Also, for a time, the Indy 500 was a round of the F1 Championship, and the European teams tended to no-show for that. You get my point. So Prost and Senna arrived at Suzuka with the championship permutations being at this point that Senna only needed one more point than Prost to win the championship. If Prost outscored Senna, then the title showdown would go down to Adelaide. And there was that little bit of added pressure. The last two Japanese Grand Prix hadn't gone well for Senna. In 1988 he'd fluffed the start from pole and dropped to 14th, but in that overpowered McLaren he was able to come back and win the race and take the title at the same time. While in 1989 he'd started from pole and dropped behind Prost at the start, which later culminated in that crash at the chicane. Then there's the whole thing revolving around which side of the grid pole position should be on. If you're a Senna fan, you probably believe one story, and if you're a Prost fan or just a racing fan in general, you probably believe the other one. So it's either scandal or the way it was done. The term pole position is borrowed from horse racing. The fastest horse starts on the inside, closest to the pole. For a long time, motor racing borrowed from this, given that the fastest driver in qualifying had the inside line for turn 1 to give him the shortest route to that corner. Most tracks have now abandoned this tradition, but tracks such as Bathurst, Spa and a few others keep pole on the inside closest to the pit wall. However, in 2010 the drivers lobbied for pole at Malaysia to be swapped, but tracks such as Sepang and Shanghai are weird ones where the racing line crosses the grid. Snetterton also has pole on the inside of turn 1. In the first Japanese Grand Prix at Suzuka in 1987, Gerhard Berger had pole position, where he started on the dirty side of the grid. In 1988 and 1989, Senna had started from pole position, which was on the dirty side of the grid. For 1990, it would be on the dirty side of the grid again, by which point Senna had decided that this was a problem. And this is where things get a little bit grey. There's two stories here. One of them is the accepted version, which has multiple variations, so it's up to you to decide which one's the actual correct one, and the other is the fan theory. So the first story will be the one that is the most consistent, given it's the story that all the high-profile, in inverted commas, websites such as, Formula 1, Race Fans, BBC, Motorsport.com and so on have. On the Wednesday, or at some point around that time, it was before qualifying, or so they say, Senna had gone to the race officials and asked for pole to be switched to the clean side of the track. Now here's where the variations begin. The FIA either said yes, or Senna believed they'd said yes, with Senna then banging in an absolutely insane pole time to be the only man in the 136s, and then being told, no, we never said yes, you're still starting on the right hand side of the track. or it was, lol no, we've changed our minds. The actual story is in there somewhere, but nobody knows exactly what it is. Other story is the one that Senna's more enthusiastic fans, let's say, believe. And that story is, Senna got pole position that was on the clean side of the track, only for the FIA to change which side it was on after qualifying to give Prost the cleaner line, which is rubbish. As we've already confirmed previously, pole position was always there. It does get a little bit more confusing though, because it says on Wikipedia that Senna and Berger went to the officials after qualifying to get it all sorted, only for the FIA to either say no, yes, or yes, then no because of interference from elsewhere. And I have done a video on the whole myth about pole position being swapped ages ago, but the story is that Senna asked at some point before qualifying for it to be done, or after. I don't think we'll ever know what really happened. One interesting thing to note about qualifying though is that there was no pre-qualifying for this race, because the Life Team and Eurobrun had both withdrawn from the season by this point. The Life Team. Flashbacks to the second ever episode of this series. I also covered Eurobrun at one point as well. I think that was one of the deleted videos. Oh well, it's an excuse to make it again, but the 4 cars left that would have had to pre-qualify with Life in Eurobrun there now went into the proper qualifying session on Friday and Saturday. But they were all outside of the top 26, so it was all for nothing really. This wasn't the only thing that infuriated Senna, however, because in the driver's briefing prior to the race, they had now received clarification that they would not be disqualified for cutting the chicane. And then Nelson Piquet, who is a man that had no reason to like Senna. I mean, at one point he called him a Sao Paulo taxi driver that hated women. True story. Basically spoke up saying that if you turn around and go against the flow of traffic to get back on the track where you were supposed to be, you've got cars approaching you at about 160, 170 miles an hour, and they're going to be coming head on, and it's all dangerous. And the drivers all agreed with that point, causing Senna to get upset and leave the room. Senna would later say, "This is really shit, you know. I say to myself, okay, you try to do your job properly and you get fucked by stupid people. If on Sunday at the start, because I'm in the wrong place, Prost beats me off the line, at the first corner, I'm going to go for it. And he better not turn in, because he's not going to make it." And we've all seen that footage a million times. F1 race broadcasts, the Top Gear special they did for his 50th birthday, the Senna documentary, or just in general on YouTube. And we all know how it happens. Prost gets the better start, they're going towards turn 1, Prost is slightly ahead, he turns into the corner, Senna doesn't even brake, and into the back of the Ferrari, and they both end up in the gravel trap. Ow. The whole thing was over in 9 seconds. Murray Walker and James Hunt were in the booth that day, and Murray's words became immortalised thanks in part to that tone, that enthusiasm, and, well, the words used. Prost has taken the advantage. Senna tries to go through on the inside, and it's happened immediately. This is amazing. Senna goes off at the first corner, but what has happened to Alain Prost? He's gone off too. They could have red flagged the race. In the late 1990s into the early 2000s, they probably would have done, and Senna and Prost would have taken the restart in the spare cars, because the first start would have been null and void because it had happened on lap 1. It makes you wonder though, would Senna have done it again if that race had been restarted? Leave your own thoughts in the comments. But they didn't red flag the race, and Senna was champion. And, James Hunt confirmed that by saying, "Yes, and that makes Senna world champion this year." That's my James Hunt impression. Prost was apoplectic afterwards, saying, "If everybody wants to drive this way, then this sport is finished. Senna is completely opposite in character to what he wants people to believe. He is the opposite of honest. Motor racing is sport, not war. Losing this way is disgusting. We were not even side by side. This man has no value." Senna, on the other hand, blamed Prost for the crash, saying he'd closed the door. Again. The French sports minister was trying to get the FIA to not award a title, while the news around the world didn't exactly paint F1 in a great light, but it was publicity either way. At the next Grand Prix in Adelaide, Senna was in an interview with Jackie Stewart, who was working for Australian TV at the time. And it's the famous interview where Jackie kicked things off by asking why Senna was involved in more collisions than any other world champion combined. Something that Senna took exception to. I find it amazing for you to make such a question, Stuart, because you are very experienced, Senna responded, which then led to the infamous lines, I don't race to come second, third or fifth, I race to win. And if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver. I actually found an article from 1991, so 12 months after the 1990 Japanese Grand Prix, where Senna is basically still denying that he had any responsibility for that crash. He denied it when he was shown a picture of him absolutely leathering the back of Prost's car and not the side, which is what Senna initially claimed he hit, and was also shown a video where he denied responsibility when that video showed that he hadn't even lifted. The engine note hadn't even changed. He kept his foot to the floor, and apparently they've seen the telemetry as well, some of these journalists, where no lift actually happened. Now, if you've got kids in the room, you might want them to pop out for a few minutes. Senna said he took a chance. It didn't work because I went for it. I didn't care if we crashed. He turned and we crashed. But that's as a result of 1989 and a result of all the shit that I already told you and you already know. It was unavoidable. It had to happen. It was bad. Bad for me and bad for everyone. And I was already fighting for something that was correct, because I was fucked from the year before. I was fucked in the winter. I was fucked in the qualifying procedure when I got pole and was supposed to be on the good side. If it had been, I would have got the better start and nothing would have happened because I would have had the better start. I would have been first without any problem. It was a bad decision by Balestri. It was not my responsibility. I did contribute to it, but it's not my responsibility. And you probably could take all of this as an admission of Senna doing it deliberately. I did it because I was screwed. I endangered somebody else's life because of something somebody else did. And Senna was all safety, 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 safety. You know, he was very hurt and very upset when Martin Donnelly had his crash at Jerez. He stopped his car to help Eric Comas. He was very good friends with Professor Sid Watkins. They would consult each other, and the famous story of, you know, give it all up and go fishing with me, Ayrton, and all that stuff. But then he would go and plough his McLaren into the back of Prost's Ferrari at 160 miles an hour because of something that happened 12 months ago and pole not being on the correct side. And this isn't me slamming or hating on Senna. I find it genuinely interesting about these two sides of him. You know, the very quiet, very contemplative Senna that we always saw, the guy that, you know, looked after the other drivers, you know, the Eric Comas thing and all of that stuff. But without this Jekyll and Hyde character, we wouldn't have had the rivalry with Prost that we saw. I was 8 days old when this happened, so a little bit different. But I know that there's going to be two camps in the comments. There's going to be the people that think that Prost deserved it, and there's going to be the people that think that it's unexcusable and Senna should have been banned for a very long time. Like I say quite often, Schumacher was kicked out for less. But I did find another article from 1991, and I'm going to leave you with this because it's quite interesting, and I'm going to be paraphrasing it because of, you know, politics and stuff like that. Jim Beam put his name to a whiskey, but nobody has ever suggested through history that drink should be held more responsible for a child being killed by a drink driver than the person behind the wheel. The ultimate responsibility is that of the driver. Senna's comments and the sentiment behind them are shocking because this man drives racing cars for a living, because this man often takes time off to tell others how they should drive and tell people what tactics are acceptable and what aren't. What Senna is basically saying here is that nobody is allowed to overtake him or beat him into a corner, and that the price, if they do, could well be an accident. With Prost and Senna out of the race, the winner was a Benetton and a Brazilian 1-2, as Nelson Piquet won the race ahead of his teammate Roberto Moreno. Aguri Suzuki took a home podium place for the Lola team, while Riccardo Patrese and Thierry Boutsen in the Williams cars were in behind. It also meant that Senna secured the championship, albeit in highly controversial circumstances thanks to the aforementioned best scores counting rule, and this race would make every highlight reel for eternity. Prost was no threat to Senna during 1991. He'd take a sabbatical in 1992 and return in 1993, and this kicked off the rivalry one final time. Senna saying that Prost was a coward for having the no Senna clause in his contract, and Prost saying that he wasn't going to race people that weren't afraid to die. Now really, Prost was no saint. I know that it's always one versus the other, but Prost was more covert, Senna more overt. but at least they managed to bury the hatchet before the untimely death of Senna at Imola in 1994. And Suzuka 1989 and Suzuka 1990 are the two big battles of what most would consider F1's most bitter rivalry. So then, a look at the 1990 Japanese Grand Prix. If you've learned something new here today, or just been reminded of stuff, or you've had some extra information given to what you already know, then do give the video a like. And if you want to see more trips through motorsports history books and the other stuff I do here, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything I do here. Massive thanks to the kind folk over at Patreon, and if you want to help out with the image purchasing, you can help out by following the link in the description, using Super Thanks for a one-off donation, or you can join my socials and Discord using links that are also down in the description with Patreon. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind. Have a cracking day wherever you live in the world, and I'll see you all again soon for another video. Goodbye.